Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm David Woo. Welcome to the Money Game, where we make actionable predictions about the big stories shaping the world today. If you're interested in making money, you're in the right place. If you're not, this program's designed for anyone who's just interested in learning about what makes our world tick. Please subscribe at davidwoonbound.com if you haven't done so already. Before we kick off the show this week, I want to share with you two statements I came across this week that kind of trouble me. The first one was from the actor Alec Baldwin. He was asked during a TV interview if he felt guilty over the death of Halyna Hutchins. And this is what he said. No, I feel that someone is responsible for what happened, and I can't say who that is, but I know it's not me. The second statement was from Janet Yellen when she was asked by Congress about the role that the $1.9 trillion fiscal stimulus had played, for which, by the way, she was the chief architect in driving the recent surge in inflation. And this is what she said. It is certainly true that the American Rescue Plan put money in people's pockets and contributed to strong demand in the U.S. economy, but if you look at the amount of inflation that we have and its causes, that is at most a small contributor. I've been trying to figure out which of these two statements is more troubling of the two. I think what Alec Baldwin said at the end of the day, all it showed was that he is heartless. But then again, that is not that surprising. But I think what Janet Yellen said is so dishonest that I think actually gives a bad name to the economics profession. There is no question that the $1.9 trillion fiscal stimulus, as I've argued on numerous occasions on this show, was the reason why we saw a 20% plus increase in household spending by U.S. households this year that completely overwhelmed the global supply chain. So from that point of view, I definitely do not think that the fiscal stimulus played only a small part in the recent inflationary, basically, crisis that the world and the U.S. are now confronting. There's a lot to talk about this week, but I've got to start with Omicron. Not because I think it's especially important, but only because I think that the overreaction to Omicron that we're starting to see by governments around the world might end up doing more damage than basically the new variant itself. You may remember from last week that I made the case that Omicron may turn out to be good news if it turns out to be contagious, but not so lethal. And in fact, the evidence that we got this week more or less confirms my hunch. For example, the biggest outbreak of Omicron outside South Africa today happened in Norway. On November 26, a Norwegian company organized a Christmas party to which it invited only those who were fully vaccinated. In fact, everyone who were allowed to attend had to basically be tested the day before. So they took great care, basically, in the preparation of this party. And yet, of the 120 people who attended the party, guess what? More than half have been tested positive for COVID-19, with at least 13 confirmed to have the new variant Omicron. And by the way, a few of these people who attended the party had just returned from South Africa on business. But the key thing is this. None of the patients so far has severe symptoms. In fact, none has been hospitalized. So this anecdote, which I think is interesting because the size of the sample that we've got here, out of 120 people, 60 people became infected. That's a very, very basically high infection rate, suggesting that this thing indeed is quite contagious, and yet none actually has anything but mild symptoms so far. Even more reassuring is the fact that the World Health Organization told us this week that so far nobody's died of Omicron. Now, I think that's a pretty important statement, especially as it includes South Africa, because the new variant has been raging in South Africa for now almost 3 weeks. Now let's look at the South African numbers. As you can see, the first chart on the slide, that the number of new cases in South Africa is going through the roof. Yeah, this thing is very contagious, but tell me something I don't already know. The second chart shows you that new hospital admissions have been going up, but much more slowly than the number of new cases. But most interesting of all is the fact that actually the number of new deaths actually fell in South Africa this week relative to last. Perhaps, we have yet to see the lagged effect, from the new variant, into new deaths. But the fact that 3 weeks into this, new deaths are actually not going up, and so far not a single person has died in South Africa, I think that should alleviate a lot of your concerns, especially given the fact that South Africa most likely is going to be the worst case scenario, simply because only 20% plus of the population has been vaccinated. In other words, almost everywhere else, Omicron is probably going to be much less dangerous. Meanwhile, COVID's fifth wave, driven by Delta, continues to gain ground, and it looks like it's about to soon overtake the fourth wave in terms of the number of new confirmed cases daily globally. I've been telling you now for the last 2 months that the fifth wave was inevitable because of the waning effectiveness of the vaccines. You may recall 6 weeks ago, I shared with you an analysis that I did based on OECD cross-country, basically correlation between vaccination rate and infection rate, from which I concluded that vaccines are not likely to be very effective after 4 months. Guess what? This, observation that I made has been now confirmed by a new Swedish study that's about to be published in Lancet that shows exactly that vaccines are not very effective after 4 months. They looked at Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. In the case of Pfizer, they showed that it's completely ineffective against infection after 211 days. Moderna's effectiveness declines to just 59% after 181 days, and AstraZeneca, in general, is ineffective against infection just after 121 days. This analysis once again reaffirms that what we need to do now, more so than anything else, is to simply give out the booster shot to as many people as possible. The solution seems so obvious that it honestly pains me to watch ineffectual governments dragging their feet when it comes to the implementation. So far, just 12% of Americans have received the third booster shot. In Germany, still less than 15%, the UK less than 25%, whereas in Israel, it's already got to 45%, more than basically 6 weeks ago. The bottom line is this, governments are spending way too much time, in my view, trying to basically push through vaccine mandates, which are politically basically convenient for the governments, but ultimately they only address a very small part of the problem. So what's my bottom line? The reaction by governments around the world to the news of Omicron this week strike me as not only excessive, but actually, counterproductive, especially given the fact it's now scaring markets into thinking that a major economic downturn could be just around the corner. Meanwhile, incredibly, the administration of the booster remains extremely slow in both Europe and the US, and that, as we move into winter, risks turning into a totally manageable problem into a major crisis. So you might say, well, what are the market implications? I am facing a serious personal dilemma. Should I assume here that governments will eventually get it, or get it fairly soon? Because if you want to basically make that assumption, you should buy stocks. Or should we basically assume that governments will remain incompetent and that mismanagement will continue, and for that you want to sell stocks? Honestly, at this point, I don't know. It is very, very, very tough. On that note, let's now turn to the next topic, the Iran nuclear negotiation. I think that topic actually I can see somewhat more clearly beyond the next couple of weeks. So the seventh round of nuclear negotiation involving Iran, France, Germany, UK, Russia, and China started this week. In case you haven't heard, the real highlight of the negotiation was the two documents that Iran submitted to the other countries. In the first document, Iran basically is demanding the immediate removal of all sanctions, In the second document, Iran has basically backtracked all the compromised language on rolling back its nuclear program that he had agreed to previously in the first six rounds of the negotiation. Now, there's no question Iran in that sense really seriously upped the ante. And as I told you a couple of weeks ago, most likely this is because Iran feels like it's got the backing of both China and Russia. This gamble by Iran left Europe and the US with little choice but to walk away from the negotiation table. This is what Anthony Blinken said. He said, what we've seen in the last couple of days is that Iran right now does not seem to be serious about doing what's necessary to return to compliance, which is why we ended this round of talks in Vienna. He also said if the path to return to compliance with the agreement turns out to be a dead end, we will pursue other options. Blinken also added that he did not want to basically allow Iran to basically drag out the negotiation in order to buy time as it continues to enrich uranium. Meanwhile, the French President Emmanuel Macron, who was visiting the Middle East, actually went on to add that I think it's very difficult to find an agreement if the Gulf countries, Israel, all those whose security is directly affected, don't take part. Well, that's a new overture from the Europeans. But the bottom line here is that, as I've been saying for the last 2-3 weeks, that this basic negotiation was doomed from the very start. With Europe and the US having walked away from the negotiation table, Iran now has to show that it means business, that it is not bluffing. In fact, I think it's very likely over the next few weeks, next couple of months, tops, that Iran is going to increase its stockpile of enriched uranium, and in fact even start moving towards 90% purity. Now already, over the past month, Iran said that it's increased its stockpile of 60% enriched uranium to 25 kilos. Also, just last week, IAEA announced that Iran has started basically feeding, its advanced centrifuges with uranium in Fordow, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a second, which will allow Iran to enrich uranium there to 20% purity very soon. A good chess player tries to think 2 or 3 moves out. The question right now is, if Iran were to escalate, what will Israel do next? Now this week, the head of Mossad, the Israeli spy agency, came out saying that Iran will not have nuclear weapons, not in the coming years, not ever. This is my promise, that is Mossad's promise. Big talk, but I have no doubt that Israel is right, that only a credible military threat can discourage Iran's nuclear ambition. And by the way, in case you don't know, the received wisdom in the intelligence community today is that Iran can produce enough 90% enriched uranium, enough for a single nuclear bomb within just 1 month. While I have no doubt about Israel's determination to stop Iran at all costs, simply because nuclear threat from Iran for Israel is existential, I do think that we need to recognize that Israel faces some serious constraints. In fact, it needs to basically work through these constraints if it should be able to resort to a military option. Now, constraint number 1. Iran's nuclear activities are very much spread out. In other words, Israel cannot just send 20, 30 planes to go bomb one place. Most likely, any such operation will involve hundreds of planes requiring complex coordination, bombing multiple sites at the same time. The second problem, which is even more serious, is the fact that most of these facilities are buried deep underground. In fact, Fordow reactor, and that's the Fordow I was telling you about, is built under a mountain. This is why in the 2015 accord, the Americans insisted that Iran cease all enrichment activity in Fordow. And Iran just started enrichment there again last week. Now, which means that for Israel to go after, let's say, Fordow, it needs to have a bomb that's powerful enough to penetrate the mountain. The only country that has such a basically weapon is, of course, the United States. But Washington, until now, has refused to provide Israel with this bunker buster bomb. Now, by the way, even if Biden were to change his mind about this tomorrow, Israel does not have the aircraft to carry such a bomb. And even if Israel did have such an aircraft, right now Israel doesn't have the airport infrastructure for such a basic plane to take off. The only planes that are big enough to carry such a bomb will be the B-52 and B-2, okay? And guess what? Okay, the New START treaty between U.S. and Russia currently bans the U.S. from being able to sell the B-2 and B-52 to a third party. Trump actually was thinking about discontinuing the New START treaty, but Biden just renewed this treaty for another 5 years as of basically February. So from that point of view, this is one serious dilemma. Even if Israel were to go ahead and bomb Iran, okay, without the planes, without the bombs, it may not be able to do exactly what it wishes to do, which actually makes it less basically compelling a basically mission. The second constraint that Israel faces is the fact that in all likelihood, Iran's many regional proxies will retaliate against an Israeli or Israeli-Saudi joint attack against Iran. I mean, the Hezbollah, for example, today is estimated to have an arsenal of 130,000 rockets. Okay, Hamas, 30,000 rockets. Okay, the Houthis in Yemen that have been basically, fine-tuning and improving their rockets now have a whole full range of rockets that they can shoot at will at Saudi Arabia. Everybody remembers these powerful images from the 2021 Gaza war, whereby Israel's Iron Dome neutralized 95% of the incoming rockets from Gaza. But there's also no doubt that this war also exposed the vulnerability of the Iron Dome, because the Hamas figured out one way to basically neutralize the Iron Dome is through massive and concentrated bombardment. That's how about 60 rockets basically managed to get through the defense shield. We have to remember that the Hezbollah in Lebanon, okay, is a far more formidable enemy than Hamas, with more basically rockets and missiles, more sophisticated rockets and missiles, with a much more better trained basically army than Hamas. All this basically means is that in the event Israel were to attack Iran, the retaliation from Hamas from the south, from Hezbollah from the north, could potentially lead to, the army being stretched very thin, exposing the population to potentially hundreds of deaths. That is a cost that any Israeli government will have to think very hard about before embarking on such basically attack of Iran's nuclear facilities. The third constraint Israel faces has to do with the fact that the new government is more fragmented than the previous government, and from that point of view, there is not basically a consensus about what to do about Iran across the many coalition partners. What this means is that for Israel to essentially go and attack Iran, most likely it will need green light or certainly support from Washington. Now, I think the question then is, even if Biden is willing to entertain such support, I think Biden knows very well that such an attack will likely trigger another spike in oil price. Okay, and given Biden seems to be already extremely concerned about, high oil prices, this is the reason why he decided to release strategic reserves. He also knows that another spike in oil price most likely is going to bring on a recession just before the 2022 midterm elections, which of course will be a complete disaster for the Democratic Party. So what's my bottom line? I think from Biden's perspective, I think the game plan must be, let's keep talking to Iran, but if they don't basically, come through, then there's a window for action immediately following the 2022 midterm election. Okay? Biden must think that, a successful joint U.S.-Israeli-Saudi strike on Iran could actually produce a massive boost for him at home, which he sorely needs. Maybe that's the message that, Jerusalem is getting from Washington, which is that, hold your horses. And meanwhile, Israel may decide, let's just basically continue to engage in covert actions to slow down Iran's basically progress from making a bomb. Now, everything I just told you, presumably, Iran can figure out for themselves. If Iran thinks that by 2023, let's say the beginning of 2023, there is a genuine, basically, probability that the U.S. can unleash military action against Iran, then guess what? If I'm Iran, I'm going to be basically in a mad sprint to basically go for the finish line in the next basically 12 months, that is to produce a bomb. Because once you have a bomb, guess what? Then you will have the complete advantage here. From that point of view, I do think that because of these complexities, because everybody's anticipating everybody else, I personally think that over the course of 2020, basically you will see an escalation of tension across the Middle East over this issue that will definitely have basically major economic and market impact. Let's turn to another major geopolitical topic that is basically raising some eyebrow in the market. Earlier this week, Washington Post published an article citing an unnamed Biden administration official saying that Russia is planning to attack Ukraine. The word has it that the current number of Russian troops near the Ukrainian border is already at 94,000, and this is expected to rise to 175,000 very soon, and that they're massing in 4 different locations with the arrival of tanks and artillery, and more importantly, according to the source, the apparent movement of the Russian troops 2 and 4, basically from the border, is designed to obfuscate intentions and create uncertainty. Separately, the Ukrainian defense minister this week, speaking to the Ukrainian parliament, basically suggested that actually the most probable time when Russia will be ready for the escalation is the end of January, which is less than 2 months away. According to the Ukrainian defense minister, Putin wants to, loosen the blockage of water from Ukraine to Crimea, that he annexed 7 years ago, that's creating a drought there. As much as I want to believe that Putin really cares about the water consumption of the people in Crimea, I actually don't think it actually makes any sense at all. After all, 7 years after Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine's military today is battle trained. They've got more sophisticated, better weapons from Europe, from America. Meanwhile, Russia is still struggling with the COVID pandemic. In fact, at least according to one estimate, Russia has now overtaken the U.S. as now leading the world when it comes to excess deaths since the start of the pandemic. Moreover, Putin's approval rating is now near the lowest level in 20 years. Why would Putin want to get basically dragged into potentially protracted conflict in Ukraine that just for some water? I strongly suspect that behind the smoke and mirror, all this posturing around Ukraine is not about Ukraine, but about Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that will deliver natural gas directly from Russia to Germany, that currently is being held up by regulatory delay. There is no question that, this pipeline forms the strategic centerpiece of Putin's basically policy vis-a-vis Europe. And I think from that point of view, he probably will do just about anything to make sure that this pipeline, basically gets approved ASAP. Putin also knows that his time is running out because the opposition to Nord Stream 2 is growing. Just this week, Kremlin basically said that the U.S. must not put pressure on anyone over the certification of the pipeline. They strongly suspect that basically the regulatory delay has everything to do with the opposition of the pipeline by the Biden administration. Meanwhile, a new German government is about to take office within weeks. And one of the coalition partner, the Green Party, is basically officially very much against the Nord Stream 2 project. In fact, Annalena Baerbock, the new foreign minister of Germany, said that we can't allow ourselves to be blackmailed by Russia. Moscow plays a poker game and is responsible for the high gas prices in Europe. Putin needs to move fast if there's any chance that he could still salvage basically this pipeline. If I'm Putin, I must be thinking that this winter basically is giving me the most leverage I'm going to have for a long time, possibly. That is because, in Europe right now, you've got these very, very high level of natural gas price. So from that point of view, any basically skirmish over Ukraine, could potentially put even more upward pressure on natural gas price in Europe that might force Europe to accept a compromise on the pipeline issue in order to bring such a conflict to a close. Putin is trying to use high energy price to pressure the U.S. This week, OPEC Plus, that includes Russia, announced that they would be increasing oil production by 400,000 barrels per day, in line with their previous plan. But, despite demand from the U.S. to increase a lot more. Moreover, OPEC actually signaled that they could revisit this decision at any time, which is very unusual. In other words, they're telling us that they don't have to basically wait until the next scheduled meeting to make any production adjustment. In other words, if oil prices end up falling more than they currently expect, they could basically immediately cut back production without having to wait for the next meeting. If Russia were to invade Ukraine, Europe and the U.S. will have no choice but to consider imposing sanctions on Russian oil and gas export. The problem with that is that this could potentially hurt Europe and the U.S. more than it's going to hurt Russia at the moment. And that probably is Putin's calculation that in this situation, he's going to have the upper hand to the extent that maybe he's going to be able to negotiate for basically troop withdrawal from Ukraine in exchange for approval for the gas pipeline. Certainly, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the weeks to come, especially as the weather forecast has it that Europe is going to have a particularly cold January and February, which basically makes that the optimal window for Russia to get aggressive with Ukraine. And I think for that reason, I think, oil remains the best hedge for an escalation of geopolitical risk involving Russia, US, Europe, and, as we said before, Iran. For that reason, I continue to like owning basically oil majors like ExxonMobil. Now that we've covered health, geopolitics, let's now turn our attention to economics. The November non-farm payroll data released this week showed that the economy generated only 210,000 jobs, new jobs, basically in a month. That was much worse than they expected, and as a result, the stock market sold off and the bond market rallied big time. But I actually think that the data are far stronger than it looks. The reason being that if you look at the household survey, the economy actually produced almost 2 million jobs. This is a special adjusted employment series for the household survey that is intended to mirror the establishment survey. And I think the discrepancy between the two most likely reflects the fact that there has been a big increase in terms of a number of Americans who are now becoming self-employed. Even more positive is the fact that we saw a big increase in the labor force, by more than 500,000 basically people. This certainly would suggest that, perhaps because, the expiration of the unemployment insurance benefit extension, as well as the fact that the vaccine mandate is now being challenged in multiple courts, that people are more willing to go back to basically work. Even more positive is the fact that aggregate weekly payrolls went up a lot too last month. And the way we calculate that is by multiplying essentially how many people are working, by how many hours they're working per week, by how much they're earning per hours. And then what it shows you here is that over the last 3 months, this thing is now growing at about 12% annualized rate. That is massive. The fact that it's still accelerating from very high level just tells you that actually the economy remains very strong, to the extent that it's still generating strong income growth, which implies stronger consumption growth going forward. The bond market clearly does not share my reading of the data, because 10-year Treasury yield is now trading basically 1.34%, which is the lowest level in basically a couple of months. And meanwhile, if you look at Eurodollar futures, which is the expectation of the market of the outlook for short-term rates, basically many months out, what it shows you is that the market thinks that the Fed is going to get up to 1.6% in terms of terminal Fed funds rate, and after that, the market is starting to already price in cuts. Okay, suggesting the market thinks that, you know what, once it gets to 1.6%, which will still, by the way, imply negative real interest rates, that, the U.S. will be at risk of going into recession, which will require cuts by the Fed. I honestly think that this is a little bit far-fetched. I think that requires so many assumptions that are difficult to basically defend so far out in the future. And I think from that point of view, I can only imagine basically the bond market is very much mistaken. When I look at price action across broader markets, it feels to me the market is more focused on Omicron than the Fed hiking rates. Because, if you look at this chart here, stocks went down. That's consistent with either Omicron basically worries or basically the Fed hiking rates. But the fact that actually fixed income rally, that does not feel like to me that, the market is focusing on the Fed. More likely, the non-farm payroll number, which the market views as glass half empty, is only reinforcing, basically growth concerns related to Omicron already, both of which, as I told you before, I do not share. So what's my bottom line? As I said before, I think that Omicron is going to turn out to be very mild. 2, I think the November job data were very strong. 1 + 1 equals, I think the Fed is going to accelerate the pace of reduction of bond purchase on December 15th. And for that reason, I actually continue to think that real yields need to go higher. Even though my bet on higher real yields so far hasn't paid off, so far I haven't lost too much money either. Whereas if I had been basically short nominal bonds, I would have basically gotten totally crushed. From that point of view, I continue to think that shorting real yields is a safer bet than shorting nominal yields. If there's one thing I've learned in my 20-year career on Wall Street, is this. Sometimes the best thing to do is to simply do nothing. I've been telling you guys over the last month that, I like being long cash, which would have served you pretty well if you had listened to my advice. Okay, I continue to think that cash is king in this environment, despite the fact that I think some investments are starting to look attractive. The reason why I will be very hesitant to basically start buying stocks even at these levels is because I think that the position unwinding over the last basically couple of weeks seems to have taken a life of its own. And I think from that point of view, sometimes we have to basically respect the fact that price action becomes self-reinforcing. I think the fact that, Bitcoin was down 20% last week certainly got my attention, and that might basically trigger other basically position unwind, especially among retail investors, that I think has been a very important basically support for this market. So all in all, I think that, while I'm hesitant to go short stocks, I definitely don't want to go long. At this point, I want to basically hang tight there. I like being long Exxon because I don't think there's much downside from these levels. Maybe bank stocks don't have that much downside because I still think ultimately rates are going higher. But almost everything else look like they remain vulnerable at least until after the Fed has announced that they are going to basically accelerate the pace of their tapering, which will take another 2 more weeks. So I genuinely think that this is a time to be sitting on your hands and be ready to deploy cash when the dust finally clears. On that note, talk to you next week.